Okay, comrades, we've got a lot to get through, but as the old Klingon proverb has it, 4,000 throats may be cut in one night by a running man. So let's see how quickly we can get through this. This year marks 50 years of Star Trek, the original series. The first episode, The Man Trap, was broadcast by NBC on the 8th of September 1966. And the original series finished just under 3 years later with Turnabout Intruder, which was broadcast in June '69. But of course, the series survived. It went on after the original series, which went on being repeated through the '70s and into the '80s, and still does time on television. You had the animated series in the early '70s, and then The Next Generation came up in the late '80s and ran to the mid '90s. By then, you had Deep Space Nine, when Deep Space Nine overlapped with Voyager. And finally, the last sort of proper Trek on television was the not terribly brilliantly received Enterprise, the prequel, which finished in 2005. And in addition, there's been 13 feature films since Star Trek, the slow motion picture, came out in 1979. And it would take somebody 546.25 hours, 23 days, to watch all the existing Star Trek canon back to back, and they're adding to it. So in the autumn we've got Star Trek Beyond, which is the third in the reimagined original series, what we now have to call the Kelvin timeline. In the next year, in January 2017, there'll be a new television show, as yet untitled. They don't know, we don't know where they're going to set it in terms of the canon and the rest of it. And in the half century that Star Trek has been on television, it's a cultural phenomenon now. It's been shown in 75 countries, and even people who've never watched Star Trek. And I've got two comrades came up to me when I said I was going to do this meeting and said, I've never seen it, but I know all about Dr. Spock, which explains this gag. It's Mr. Spock, if you're going to get it right. Dr. Spock is the child psychologist from the 50s. There is an argument to say that socialists, regardless of whether they actually watch the programme, should welcome its longevity and its popularity on the grounds that Star Trek is a progressive show with a progressive agenda. I mean, last year I spoke on the Hunger Games and the current vogue for dystopian fiction in films like the Hunger Games and the rest of it. And I tried to think of sort of utopias. Because there was a very interesting talk given by Hass today about this is the 500th anniversary of Thomas More's Utopia, and since the genre kicked off, approximately the first 200-300 years, there were more utopias being written about the future and how good the future's going to be. And then slowly, as we hit the 20th century, it's all dystopia, it's all horror, it's all, things are shit now, but they're going to be a lot shittier in the future. And I think Star Trek is the only popular utopia, and I'd be very pleased and interested to hear if anybody disagrees with this. I think it's the only popular utopia. That's out there. And the one word that keeps coming up more than any other when academics or cultural commentators or journalists or fans talk about Star Trek is optimism. It is an optimistic future. It shows us a very optimistic future. And that expresses itself in some very strange ways, comrade. I mean, this is Barbara Adams turning up for the Whitewater trial, which involved Clinton and the dodgy dealings in 1996. She was a jurist, investigating a presidential financial irregularities, and she turned up for her jury service dressed up in full Next Generation outfit, including a phaser and a tricorder. When they asked her why did you do that, she said that she wanted to represent Star Trek's values of tolerance, peace, and faith in all mankind. So it's a bit of it's a strange way of expressing it, but there you have it. And when we look at the fictional universe of Star Trek, it's set where all the modern day problems that we have, and we've been discussing at Marxism, have actually been overcome. In the episode Broken Bow, the first episode of the prequel Enterprise, you've got engineer Trip Tucker tells T'Pol, the Vulcan on the first Enterprise, that Earth has eliminated war, disease, hunger in less than 2 generations. And in the film First Contact, the 24th century Captain Pickard tells the 21st century Lily Sloan, the acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force of our lives. We work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity. And if you go back to the original series, these are the Cherons from Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. One of these characters, Locase, has a conversation with Chekhov, and he says, "You are from the planet Earth. There is no persecution on your planet. How can you understand my fear, my apprehension, my degradation, my suffering?" And Chekhov replies, "Well, there was persecution on Earth once. I remember reading about it in my history class." So there's no war, there's no disease, there's no mass hunger or oppression by Star Trek's 23rd century. And as a result, many people have concluded that Star Trek doesn't merely show a progressive future of equality and plenty, it shows a specifically socialist utopia. And this argument doesn't just come from the left. On the 5th of October last year, Forbes magazine, a serious economics journal, ran an article called "Star Trek Economics is Just True Communism Arriving." And it was written by a guy called Tim Wuerzel. Now, Wurzel's no socialist. He's a senior member of the Adam Smith Institute, and he supports UKIP. He stood as a UKIP MEP, and he was their press agent a few years ago. And this is what he argues in the article. Star Trek's world, he says, is the sort that Karl Marx was talking about. For the basic premise of the Star Trek universe is that we conquered scarcity, and as Marx was almost insistent about pointing out, communism couldn't arrive until the absence of scarcity. The economics of Star Trek is thus true communism, fortunately without the intervening bit of socialism that we have to suffer through first. Some nasty piece of right-wing barb there or whatever. But is it true? Do the inhabitants of Star Trek live in actually existing socialism? Is the fictional world of Star Trek one where we'd be quite happy to inhabit? And is it the world that Marx actually argued for? Or is Star Trek not as progressive as many of its fans would insist it is? And if Star Trek does show a future where actually existing socialism is at work, why does the programme appeal to so many people who are anything but socialists? So it's quite a gruesome list of, Ted Cruz is a Star Trek fan, Al Gore is a Star Trek fan, Alex Salmon is a Star Trek fan, Colin Powell is a Star Trek fan, Richard Branson is a Star Trek fan, Bill Gates is a Star Trek fan. And when the Tory Sajid Javid became Culture Secretary in 2014, he declared himself to be a Star Trek fan. In his first in-post speech, he argued, this is a line from the speech, "What we do in this country is great because far from being ruled by central diktats, our culture is based on freedom and self-determination." He was actually quoting Captain Pickard from The Best of Both Worlds. I don't know how many people actually picked up on that, And if Star Trek is, on one level at least a socialist utopia, how can it appeal to both people like the leftist genius Stephen Hawking, who's had a cameo in The Next Generation, and it appeals also to people like the racist comedian Jim Davison. Now, I think to understand what's going on in Star Trek, we need to approach it as Marxists, and that we don't, Marxism doesn't approach cultural products as with a checklist to see how progressive they are. Does it meet this criteria? Does it meet that criteria? And whatever. Trotsky, who loved art and cultural production, for one, said it is nonsense that we demand that poets should describe inevitably a factory chimney or the uprising against capital. What he said was, to understand a work of art, you need to locate it in the more general historical circumstances that it was created in. And the thing about capitalism is that it encourages an individualistic perspective about creativity. So the legend that's built around Star Trek is that it's the almost exclusive creation and vision of Gene Roddenberry, who was born in August 21 and died in October 1991. But I'd argue that Star Trek is the product of a number of complicated and converging factors. And one of the factors I want to begin with is this film, Forbidden Planet, released by MGM in 1956. Now, in many ways, this is a visionary and optimistic film. It foresees a future where humanity survived the very real and ongoing threat of nuclear war, and they break out to explore the universe. It's set in the 23rd century. The plot's about this spaceship, the United Planets cruiser C-57D, going to the planet Altair 4 to check out what happened to a colonising crew that was sent 20 years previously. Now, the C-57D is a military spacecraft. It's under the command of a guy called J.J. Adams. His crew carry laser pistols as sidearms. They're clearly a military operation. You know, the film opens with them coming out of light speed, dropping into orbit around a planet, viewing the planet on their view screen. Does that sound familiar to anybody? You know. They go down, they meet the only two survivors of the original colony, Professor Morbius and his beautiful daughter Altera, and Adams and Altera, of course, fall in love. I mean, does that sound familiar in this context as well? Now, Forbidden Planet, I'd argue, is still an impressive film. It holds up very, very well. It had a very big budget for the period. But it is very much a film shaped of its time. And as Canadian architect Witold Rebetsky said, nothing ages faster than yesterday's vision of the future. So what we get in Forbidden Planet, we're shown an advanced technical society, but it's actually frozen socially. So, you know, we hear that, well, firstly, all the crew are male and they're all white. When they get onto the planet, we learn that the nuclear family has survived into the 23rd century. There's a character called Robbie the Robot who synthesises meals, and one of the crew say, this is a housewife's dream. There are housewives in the 23rd century, comrades, according to this film. It is a 50s future, in other words. Now, I'd say if you want to start, to understand Star Trek, we have to also set it in the context of its time. You know, Star Trek's future was a 60s future. Roddenberry began to work on it in 64. And we need to understand the background against which he was working against. Firstly, the Cold War was still very, very real. Star Trek is in production only 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis that nearly ended the planet in a nuclear war. It's set against the space race. And the space race itself was, an aspect of the Cold War. I mean, Kennedy, in September 1962, has a speech because the Americans were falling behind the Soviets in terms of space. All the early pioneering work was made by the Soviet Union. So he has a speech called "We Choose to Go to the Moon," in which he sets out the plan to put a person on the moon and bring them back safely by the end of the 60s. And he actually names space as the final frontier, and he calls it an enterprise. And this is very much picked up on and used by Roddenberry. So the 60s is a period of colonial struggle and liberation. It's a period of the Vietnam War. It's a period where black people refuse second-class status. You've got, Malcolm X. Star Trek was still in development when Malcolm X was assassinated in February 1965, and it was on the air when Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered on the 4th of April 1968. This is a period where there's the rebirth of the feminist movement with the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. This is a place where there are structural changes going on with the working class that would lead to an unprecedented period of class struggle at the end of the 60s and into the 70s. It's a period where the oppressed refuse to be oppressed anymore. Like, as I said, the last episode of the original series was broadcast on 3rd of June 1969. 3 weeks later, you got the Stonewall riots that herald the beginning of a gay liberation movement, of people taking to the streets and saying, they're not going to take oppression anymore. So that's the period which Star Trek would be developed. And having established that, we can now talk about this man, Gene Roddenberry. Now, the fact is that Roddenberry was a jobbing writer. He'd served on bombers in the Philippines during the Second World War. He joined the LA police force after the war, after his service, and he began writing in the late 40s and early 50s. He began writing for television and found he actually earned more money than he had as a policeman. So he quit his job as a police a policeman and began to write for television at the time. Now, Roddenberry, I'd argue, he's been morphed into this sort of, huge visionary, this wise sage, and the rest of it. And there was elements of that here. But the fact is, I think he's something of a Don Draper madman figure. 3 martini lunches, numerous affairs, and whatever. He was a progressive in the context of his time. He was clearly anti-racist, largely as a result of seeing his father, who he called a Texan bigger, who was a policeman. Largely, he said that he broke with his dad's racism. He was a humanist, but, and I think this is important, he wasn't an activist. He was a writer making a product to earn a living. And I don't think we can actually get away from that. And the thing is that television in America was huge, big business in the early 60s. Between 1962 and 1968, the gross profits of the US television industry rose from £1.3 billion to £2.5 billion. And the American television in the 60s was dominated by the big 3 networks, CBS, NBC and ABC. They controlled 60% of everything that was put broadcast at the time. And they would commission dramas using Hollywood. So 20th Century Fox, MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, all these studios would make something like 40% of everything was seen on US television in the 60s. And the potential profits were enormous. If you got primetime slot between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock, when 85% of a potential audience was estimated, I don't know what people were doing in the 60s, to be honest. All these people were just watching television in the evening. Never mind. The potential profits were huge. The #1 Nielsen-rated television show would earn up to $30 to $40 million more than the second-rated Nielsen. So there's intense competition going on to see what was what. So there were big profits, but at the same time, the format of American television, the kind of shows that were being broadcast and being made, were dominated by a very narrow sort of focus of programs. So soap operas dominated, health shows, documentaries about crises, like Casualty and all this kind of thing dominated, but especially cop shows and westerns dominated. Westerns were huge. I mean, we've actually forgotten that now, I think. But and Roddenberry wrote for them. He wrote for Dragnet, which was a dreadful right-wing cop show at the time. He wrote Have Gun Will Travel. He wrote for a thing called Wagon Train, which is quite important in the creation of Star Trek. But there was a big discussion about the kind of product that was being made for US television. In 1961, Kennedy appointed a guy called Newton Minow as head of the Federal Communications Commission, the people that oversaw what was being broadcast. And he called US television a vast wasteland. And he told the big 3, it's not enough to cater for the nation's whims, you must also serve a nation's needs. And it's at this point where there is a national discussion about what is being broadcast that Roddenberry perks up and starts firing off different shows. He does a thing called The Lieutenant, 2 seasons of a thing called The Lieutenant about an army base and a new army officer. Which at first has, the actual US Army think this is great. It's a recruiting tool for them, and they give them all the facilities they want, all the guns, all the set things and whatever. When he writes a show, when he writes an episode about racism in the US Army, they knock on the head. They will not cooperate, and it's part of the reason it's actually that it actually folds. Now, in the early 60s, apparently Roddenberry went to a baseball game with one of his mates, and he said, I've got an idea for a show. It's about an airship. It's set in Victorian times. It's about an airship going around the world having adventures. And his mate said, well, that's rubbish. That's not good. That's not going to work. And he went back and he rethought it. And in April 1964, he registers the concept of Star Trek with the Writers Guild of America for the sum of $2. And he begins to work on what this show is going to be. Now, Roddenberry's great innovation, I think, wasn't ideological. He wasn't working out how to tell great stories and whatever bugger. How to tell exotic stories or whatever. His great breakthrough is how to make a thing like the Forbidden Planet about a space navy on a regular kind of. You can see the this is Captain Pike from the first pilot. The previous one was from Planet. You can see the echoes of or the swipe, actually, the copy, to be more accurate. He works out how to do it. And in a budget, he works out how to make a weekly science fiction series, to make it work in terms of political economy. And he actually says, I mean, he denied that there was a link between the Forbidden Planet and his show, but actually there are memos that people have found that says that he made stills. He talked about how to stimulate creative thinking and how to, what to take from it and what not to take from it and whatever. And many of the technicians who worked on Star Trek also worked on Forbidden Planet. But the thing is, I think it takes something more from Forbidden Planet. Forbidden Planet is a loose retelling of Shakespeare's The Tempest, but at the heart of it is quite a Freudian argument that says that there's a secret devil in every soul that can be controlled, but at the end of the day is always going to be there, and it will always be there with human beings. So Star Trek. In March 1964, Roddenberry puts together a 16-page draft of the original concept, in which the captain is called Captain April, the starship is called the Yorktown, and begins to hawk it round the different studios. It's not about, he doesn't start from the position of saying, I'm going to show this great utopian future. He says this is a 1-hour dramatic television series with central leading characters and other regulars. In other words, this is going to be about action, it's going to be about adventure and the rest of it. And they bring out this sort of Bible to give potential writers an idea of what the concept is. And again, he says, what this is about is we must reach out and hold and entertain a mass audience of some 20 million people, or we simply do not stay on air. So yes, you may have something to say, but say it entertainingly otherwise, because we don't need essays, however brilliant. I think that's important when we come to talk about Star Trek. It was meant to be entertaining, and it was meant to be fun as well, I think. And but there were innovations. Where Forbidden Planet was a 50s future, technically advanced but socially frozen, actually Roddenberry did want his future, to be a bit more socially progressive. So Roddenberry's Starship was going to be completely international and multiracial in its makeup, where approximately 1/3 of the crew are going to be females, and where there's complete equality between members of the crew, between sexes and races, as well as humans and aliens. That comes from a very early quote from Roddenberry. And here we have, I think, the first of Star Trek's contradictions, because it's a bloody military ship. So you can talk about equality, but at the end of the day, Kirk has the last line. There's a wonderful line from the Corbomite Manoeuvre where they're in space, they're facing the evil aliens or whatever, and what his navigator says, are we going to just let it hold us here, sir? We've got phasers. I vote we blast it. And Kirk says, I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Bailey, when this becomes a democracy. In other words, it's not, the equality thing can be over-tweaked. Right, yes, okay. In November 1964, they begin to film the first pilot show. It's been picked up by a very small studio called Desilu, which was the studio that Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball ran to do their famous I Love Lucy sitcom in the 50s. And they're the only people. It's a very, very ambitious thing for a small studio like that to do, and they begin filming it. By then, Captain April has become Captain Christopher Pike, who's played by Jeffrey Hunter, who also played Jesus a few years back before this. The first officer is played by Major Barrett. She's just called Number One. She was actually Roddenberry's girlfriend at the time. There's a crusty doctor, Dr. Boyce. They were going to put a Latin guy there called Jose Ortega originally, but he became Jose Tyler, and clearly not very Latin. This is from the man. This is from Where No Man Has Gone Before. The second pilot. And the only non-white crewman in the original pilot show, The Cage, is an Asian guy who doesn't have any lines. He's sort of appointed to operate the transporter when Captain Pike is being beamed down to the planet. And NBC famously turned down the pilot as being, quote, too cerebral, too intellectual, too slow with not enough action, and worried about its eroticism. That's because I think there's this sort of green lady dancing sort of alluringly at one point in the thing. But they didn't want to get rid of it. They actually said, we like what you've done, we'll commission another series. And they said they want more action. They wanted to get rid of the female second in command, number one, and they also said get rid of Mr. Spock. Mr. Spock looks too much like the devil. We will lose the Bible Belt if it's screened there. And actually, again, Roddenberry digs his heels in and says, no, we're going to have him in the second pilot as well. The second pilot was filmed in July 1965. There's some interesting developments there. It's not the triumvirate that we know up there, we know and love. Jeffrey Hunter wouldn't come back to film it, so they cast the young Canadian actor William Shatner to play what was then James R. Kirk. They changed it to James T. famously later, James T. for Tiberius. Mr. Spock survives. And there's a bit more of a racial mix. You've got a black guy as a communications officer Alden, and George Takei comes on board as Sulu on the right there. Takei's a very, very interesting guy. He was one of the 120,000 Japanese Americans that were rounded up during the Second World War when he was a boy. Because of the Second World War, we had their property taken away, who were actually treated as enemy aliens in their own country. So it's quite interesting casting. This is only 20 years after the war and whatever that we've put all that behind and we've moved on. They add the captain's log. They add the baffling star dates, that nobody's ever been able to work out, what the hell they mean. The NBC liked it, greenlit it, and off it went. And the first episode, as I say, was broadcast in September 1966, with the addition of DeForest Kelley as Dr. McCoy and the magnificent Nichelle Nichols as Lieutenant Uhura. Now, I'm going to have to overrun, I'm afraid, by 5 minutes. Of the 29 episodes that made up the first season of Star Trek, Roddenberry only actually wrote 2, and he gave two story ideas to other people to write up. But he rewrote every script that came in, and this pissed off a lot of people because they used science fiction writers. They used people like Harlan Ellison. They used people like Richard Matheson, who wrote The Incredible Shrinking Man, and great work like that. But he wasn't a brilliant writer, Roddenberry. But what you got was a sort of consistent universe coming out of it. Those first sort of episodes of the first season, and then midway through the first series, you get a guy called Gene L. Kuhn coming on, who's about the same kind of age as Roddenberry. He's very unsung in the story of Star Trek. There are 2 Genes that really made up Star Trek. And Gene came along, and this guy wrote some of the best ever Star Treks. He wrote a thing called Devil in the Dark, which is a great show. He wrote a thing called Metamorphosis, but he also wrote the very, very worst episode, a thing called Spock's Brain, which is like best watched sort of drunk, I think. It's absolutely appalling. But under Gene Kuhn, Star Trek became much more concrete in terms of the universe that they were operating in. So the Klingons are first introduced by Gene L. Kuhn. And the United Federation of Planets, the political entity that Kirk represents, is first introduced as well. And of course the link is very clear. This is the post-war world. This is a brave new world where the UN was supposed to lead us into a unified world government. And they're sort of reflecting that and saying, well, that's going to go on. We're going to have a federal Earth, a republic, and then we're going to go out and it will be a federated, union of planets as well. That ran through lots and lots of science fiction. It's a quote I want to give about that expresses that. It goes, generally the UN, expressed the ideals of the time. We thought it was a brave new world. The United Nations organisation was going to run everything. There was going to be a world government, and it was one of those bright ideas that shine brightly when you're young and don't quite work. That actually came from Frank Hampson, the man who drew Dan Dare in the 50s. So you can see how these science fiction ideas reflect that. This is Dan Dare at the Venusian embassy. There's a train there, and they're having a great old time. But bless them. Now we're meant to identify with the United Federation of Planets. They're the good guys. Kirk in one episode says that the United Federation of Planets are humanitarians, they're statesmen. They had a dream that became a reality and spread throughout space, and it made me and Mr. Spock brothers. That's from whom the gods destroyed. But where I'd argue Gene Coon sort of refined the Star Trek ideal, it became a much more it undermined this idea of an optimistic future. So Star Trek shows us humanity surviving into the 23rd century, but in Space Seed we learned that the Earth had a bloody eugenics war in the mid-90s. In one of the episodes called Bread and Circuses, Spock reminds McCoy of the 37 million people who died in your Third World War. In an episode called Conscience of the King, we learn that Kirk survived a Holocaust-type experience on the colony on Tarsus 4, carried out by Kodos the Executioner. And again, we've got to remember, this is only a couple of years after Adolf Eichmann had been tracked down and put on trial and executed by the Israeli government. This is Kirk in the alternate universe, the mirror universe, that's supposed to show how nice our federation is, because if you go to the mirror universe, they're all fascists and everything's polar opposite and whatever. In reflecting the geopolitical situation on Earth, it could push Star Trek from allegory into agitprop, and not necessarily agitprop from the right. So I just want to play a clip from an episode called A Private Little War from February 1968.
I don't have a solution, but furnishing them firearms is certainly not the answer.
Bones, do you remember the 20th century brush wars on the Asian continent? Two giant powers involved, much like the Klingons and ourselves. Neither side felt that they could pull out.
Yes, I remember. It went on bloody year after bloody year.
Well, what would you have suggested? That one side arm its friends with an overpowering weapon? Mankind would never have lived to travel space if they had. No. The only solution is what happened back then. Balance of power.
And if the Klingons give their side even more?
Then we arm our side with exactly that much more. A balance of power. The trickiest, most difficult, dirtiest game of them all, but the only one that preserves both sides.
That's enough touch. That episode is about Klingons and the Federation battling, carrying out a proxy war on another planet, and it was screened 3 days after the Tet Offensive. It's quite interesting because it seems to be, it's written by Roddenberry, endorses, I think, the Vietnam War. It's a terrible thing, but we've got to actually do it. It was one of the many times that Star Trek was completely out of step, I think, with the times. The other thing that Kuhn introduced was a thing called the Prime Directive, which is, this is a law preventing Starfleet from interfering with the worlds they visit. It's a recognition apparently that they don't have the right or the wisdom to interfere however a planet is evolving, and we learn about it in an episode called Bread and Circuses, in which Starfleet officers can have no identification of self or mission, no interference with the social development of their said planet, no references to space or the fact that there are other worlds and other civilizations. And we learn in Deep Space Nine that the Prime Directive has 47 subclauses, so it's actually quite an iron kind of a cage of laws and the rest of it. But the problem is, of course, that Kirk and his boys do nothing but interfere, don't they? You just tick it off, Taste of Armageddon, Mirror Mirror, The Apple, The Gamesters of Triskelion, A Piece of the Action, A Private Little War, Patterns of... It does nothing but go around interfering in other cultures. And I think this is actually quite an interesting aspect of Star Trek, because it reflects very much the kind of American foreign policy of the 60s. You know, we will prop up democracies or whatever. If you're not a society that's to our liking, we get the phasers out and tough. Now I'm running out of time. So but I want to address two things about the original Star Trek, and then we'll open it up to your words. Trek has always argued, or people who are fans of Trek have always argued that there's no racism in the 23rd century. And in one sense, that's true. There's constant references to the fact that people get on now. That everybody's colourblind, and that we have a multiracial, multinational crew. But I think like imperialism. It's projected out into space. So Dr. McCoy, there's a running joke, didn't they, that McCoy would laugh at Spock's pointed ears, he'd call him a green-blooded alien and whatever. And there's one episode called Balance of Terror, in which they first meet the Romulans. They find out that the Romulans look exactly like the Vulcans, and there's a navigator who hates Spock because he lost family a century previously to the Romulans, and Kirk has to reprimand him. He says, "Leave any bigotry in your quarters, there's no room for it on the bridge. Do I make myself clear?" So the inference is there is still racism. It's just, Deep Space Nine, a lot of them call the Cardassians spoonheads because of that little kind of disguise they've got. In his defence, and I probably need to finish on this, but I want to spend a bit of time on Uhura. He gave us Uhura, and Uhura's influence on television in the 60s cannot be underestimated, despite the fact that all she tends to do a lot of the time is say hailing frequencies open. Apparently, I think she says it 8 times in one particular episode. There are two things I want to pick up on Uhura, because I think it shows the contradiction about Star Trek, that on one level it could be progressive, on the other level it wasn't as progressive as it actually thinks it is. There's a story, and I'll paraphrase it, that midway through the first season, Nichelle Nichols said, "I've had enough of saying hailing frequencies open. I've been offered a job on Broadway. I'm going to take it." So she goes to Gene Roddenberry on the Friday and says, I resign. And he says, "Look, it's the weekend. You go away, you think it through, you come back on Monday. If you still want to leave, fine." So she goes off, and she goes to a National Association of Coloured People's fundraiser. It was an anti-racist, I think it's probably still going, an anti-racist organisation. And somebody comes up to her and says, "Nichelle, somebody wants to speak to you." And she thinks, "Oh God, it's a trekker, it's a fan, okay, bring him on." And it's Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King comes up to her and he says, I think what you do is fantastic. And she says, "Well, I want to be marching with you." And he says, no, you are doing something. You just being there inspires people, inspires our people. It gives us a role model. She says, "Well, I've just handed in my notice." And he said, "No, you cannot do that. You cannot. What you're doing is so important." So she went back and withdrew a notice and carried on until the end of the show. And you think, well, this is nonsense. One person on TV, until you hear Whoopi Goldberg, who actually played Guinan in The Next Generation. Whoopi Goldberg said, she tells a story. She said she turned on, as a girl, she turns on the television, Star Trek comes up, she shouts to her mum, "Mummy, mummy, come in here, there's a black lady on television and she ain't no maid." And she said, after that I knew I could be anything. And this is the first black woman in space who's I can't find the sorry. Mae Jemison. She went up in the shuttle in 1991. She tells a similar story of watching television as a black girl in the 60s and seeing Uhura as a positive role model. That I think is a very important thing. And I'll finish on the kiss, because I've massively overemphasized. When people talk about Star Trek, the thing that they always talk about is that it broke a racial barrier, in that for the first time you had a white actor kisses a black actor, and it's Kirk and Spock's famous kiss. So this is from a story called Plato's Stepchildren.
I'm thinking of all the times on the Enterprise when I was scared to death. would see you so busy at your command. And I would hear your voice from all parts of the ship. And my fears would fade. And now they're making me tremble. But I'm not afraid. I am not afraid.
See, I don't think that's particularly progressive, comrades. You know, Kirk has been. This is one of the third season stories. Kirk has been going around the galaxy, sleeping with anything with a pulse, but he has to be forced to kiss Uhura by the mental powers of the decadent Platonians. And I think there's a contradiction at the heart of Star Trek. It is a 60s future in the same way that the Forbidden Planet was a 50s future. There's a limit to the progressive arguments that it puts. Now, I've overrun. I can finish the rest of this talk in my summing up, but for now, I think we should hear. I think we should hear what you've got to say. Peace and long life, live long and prosper. The second part of my meeting, comrades. What I tried to show in the first part was there was a relationship, not a direct one-to-one relationship, but a relationship between the struggles and the optimism of the 60s for all the problems of the Cold War and whatever. There were people fighting for liberation as black people, as gay people, as women. And that filtered through into Star Trek. Not a one-to-one, it filtered through. Art mediates the real world. It doesn't reflect it exactly. We wouldn't need art if it just reflected it. So there were progressive things about Star Trek, and there were. I think it did. This optimistic future. I think it did. There were things that still. They're still there. It's a very colourful show for a start. All these bright blues and mustard yellows and whatever. But it was conceived in the early 60s, and like the man said, nothing ages quicker than yesterday's vision of the future. And the way they treated women, I think, was very contradictory. In the cage, in that first pilot episode. The second officer is number one. All the women in the cage wear slacks, by the way. They've got tops. They wear trousers. To do a second pilot, they had to drop the second in command. Now the studio says that was because she wasn't a very good actress. I think they got a point, to be honest. Roddenberry always said it was because she was a woman, and when they screened it in front of a test audience, the women in the audience said they didn't like her as a character. There's all sorts of contradictions bound up in there. So they drop her. Spock has moved up in terms of the ranks and whatever. When the actual series gets the green light, they put all the women in cocktail dresses. And one of them is because of Janice. Very practical for the 23rd century. The last episode of the original series is called Turnabout Intruder, and the plot is. One of Kirk's many ex-girlfriends, a bitter woman, transfers her consciousness into his body and his consciousness into hers because Starfleet doesn't have women officers. Really, in the 24th century. And the story is, I think it's a critique of the women's movement, because what it's saying is she literally wants to be a man. And it's a very sad ending for a show. It was cancelled mid-season, and it's a very sad ending. And when you think about the politics of the show, when Roddenberry was putting the character of Uhura together, he wrote up the guide for writers. He said, Uhura is torn between the idea of someday becoming a wife and mother and the desire to remain in the service as a career officer. Now, come the 70s, when Star Trek is off the air and they're just they're just going through these almost interminable reruns of the series, you know, just think of what the real world had thrown up in terms of, women's liberation or whatever. I mean, I noticed they've got a copy of Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectics of Sex downstairs in bookmarks. This is a book that came out of the feminist struggle of the 60s and 70s, and she's demanding, artificial reproduction to lift the burden of maternity from women. She's demanding collectives. She's demanding all sorts of things as a real political demand that went way beyond anything Star Trek ever offered or reflected in terms of women and whatever. And when so somebody asked a question about the cocktail dresses and women and whatever, I think Roddenberry had a very fixed idea of women as, we want them. Yes, this is a classic moment of Star Trek. He had a very fixed idea of women. Yeah, he wanted equality, but he was also a massive womanizer. And when he was putting together the original Trek, he wrote up a character called Yeoman Colt. And he said she's a capable officer, but she has a strict queen figure that even her uniform cannot disguise. When he came to write the notes for Deep Space Nine, he wrote, Beverly Crusher is a brilliant doctor, but she has a strict queen figure that even her uniform cannot disguise. In other words, he hadn't moved very far in 20 odd years. And actually, he brings he wrote the Next Generation. He wrote Star Trek: the Motion Picture. It made lots of money, but it's a very dull film. And for the rest of the films, they actually keep him away from it as an advisor. And but he did manage to talk NBC into doing a new series of Star Trek. He recast it. It's 80 years after Captain Kirk's time. It's on a ship that's 8 times bigger. But the first season of Star Trek is boring as fuck, because in the intervening period, he'd been told so often that he was a visionary. The fan base expands. The first Star Trek convention is in 1972. Now, nobody who ever worked on the original Star Trek needs work properly again. They can just go around signing. Even if you're the third Romulan on the back, holding your phaser in the air, you can make a decent living going to different conventions signing. But Roddenberry had done that for nearly 20 years, and he'd been told to everyone, you're a great visionary, you show the future, you're a futurist. So he turns up with Deep Space Nine. He says, no conflict. There is no conflict in the 24th century. We cannot have arguments on the bridge. We cannot have any contradictions on the bridge and whatever. And the first season of that Next Generation is awful. And ironically, it was saved by a strike. The writers' strike of 1988 lasted most of the summer. By the time it was over, Roddenberry was quite happy to pot around on the golf course and collect his cheque as executive producer, and the scripts get better after that. There is conflict and whatever. And the last thing that he ever commented on was Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country, which was a deliberate allegory. Nimoy suggested the story. It's the last film where all the original crew are in it, Nimoy said, Klingons have always been our version of the Russians. Why don't we do the Berlin Wall coming down in space? And they write the script. The problem is to make it work as a sort of allegory of different hostile sides coming together. They have to give the crew absolutely ridiculously out of character dialogue. So Kirk says, I've always hated Klingons. I will never forgive them. They killed my boy. And they wanted to write the line, guess who's coming to dinner, for Nichelle Nichols to say when the Klingons come on board. That's quite incendiary in terms of, anybody who knows the film, it was a Sidney Poitier film in the early 60s about a white woman marrying a black man, and the kind of confusion it sets up in her parents, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. And she refused to say that line. They gave it to Chekhov, and she said, what the hell was going on? And Nick Mayer, who actually wrote it and directed it, he said they showed Roddenberry the rushes. He didn't like it. He drew up a real critique saying, come on, my Star Trek is non-racism. And Nick Mayer said, Mr. Roddenberry really believed in the perfectibility of man, of humans, and I have yet to see evidence for this. So our film film is a film in which the crew of the Enterprise have all kinds of prejudices, racial prejudices vis-à-vis the Klingons, and some of their remarks, including how they look alike and what they smell like, and all these xenophobic things are what the film is about. And it was deeply offensive to him because he thought there wasn't going to be any of that in the future. What you've got there is the 60s Trek future coming up against the 90s Trek. In between, you know, that kind of optimism, that kind of we're going forward, there's going to be a better world, technology is going to liberate us, and the rest of it. We've had the neoliberal. Well, yeah, we've had Thatcher, we've had Reagan since then, and it's, you know, that kind of future isn't sustainable. It's not, you know, and actually Starfleet in the films from the 90s and in the early noughties, it's not this instrument of civilization anymore. This is, you know, this is what Kirk calls it this is what Kirk calls it in Journey to Babel. That the United Federation of Planets and Starfleet are instruments of civilization. That goes by the board. And I want to end in 5-10 minutes with a clip that I think puts words into Sisko's mouth, the captain of Deep Space Nine, that they could never have put into Kirk's mouth. And I think that's because, you know, when they filmed it, it was after the first Gulf War, it was after the wars in Yugoslavia, it was after the retreat in terms of civil rights and all this other thing. But I want to bring up something else when people talk about how progressive Star Trek is. And I think the best way to illustrate it is a character called Zefram Cochrane. So Zefram Cochrane, in the mythology of Trek, is the man who creates the first warp engines in the 22nd century. And we first meet him, played by this actor, in the episode Metamorphosis, which is actually quite a really nice little story. I mean, the comrade asked about same-sex relationships in Star Trek. I think Star Trek is very, very bad at that. This was quite an interesting episode because it's about Zefram Cochrane as an old man lands on this asteroid, and there's this cloud that rejuvenates him, and they live together for 150 years, and he's shocked to find out it is a female, and it actually loves him. It's about, you know, two different species, I suppose, loving each other, but I think it's clearly an allegory about same-gender relationships and the rest of it. But that's the only way Star Trek ever dealt with them. So there is an episode where two female characters kiss, but that's because they've got a Trill symbiote inside of them, and when a particular body dies, the Trill goes into another body and carries the memories. So this is a previous love affair. In other words, they only really show LGBT plus relationships in the context of a gimmick of an alien. So I think, but when we first meet this guy, he's quite humble, he's dignified, and he says, you know, he at the end of the episode, he decides to stay on this planet because the energy cloud has become a woman that he can love properly, if you like, in that context. But actually, he asks Kirk not to tell the rest of the universe. He's not interested in honours. He's not interested in all that sort of thing. When we next meet Zefram Cochrane, it's in the 1996 film First Contact, which tells the story of the Borg going back to stop Cochrane, now played by a different actor, from taking off in the first warp drive ship, which in Star Trek mythology is intercepted by the Vulcans. The Vulcans know we're quite an advanced race. They come down, and somehow, because we learn there's other aliens in there's other species in the universe, it unifies humanity. And you know that quote I gave about Trip Tucker saying it ends illness, it ends war, it ends disease, it ends hunger, it ends poverty. It essentially ends capitalism. The Borg are out to actually stop that. And all through the film, what you get is different Enterprise crews going, God, you're the great Zefram Cochrane, you know, we celebrate your birthday, we celebrate first Contact Day, which I think is the 4th of April, if anybody's interested to celebrate it next year. You're fantastic, your statue's going to be there, you've got whole planets. And he gets really upset about this, and he actually, you know, he actually turns around. Up until this point, he's been shown as a drunk. He's nothing like the Zefram Cochrane we met in the original series. He's a drunk. He's a sexist. He tries to grope Councillor Troy and the rest of it. just while there's a point in the film where he's had enough of them telling him how great he is, and he turns around and says, "You all look at me as if I'm some kind of saint or visionary or something. You want to know what my vision is? It's dollar signs. It's money. I didn't build this ship in order to usher in a new era for humanity. You think I want to go to the stars? I don't even like to fly. I take trains. I built this ship so that I could retire to some tropical island filled with naked women. That's Zephyr Cochrane. That's his vision. The other guy you keep talking about, this historical figure, I never met him. I can't imagine I ever will." Now this, I think, is pure Adam Smith. You know, Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, individual ambition serves the common good. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. And this is the same film in which I quoted at the beginning Pickard saying, you know, we don't have any money in the future, we don't, you know, there's no capitalism in the future, we work for our benefit and for humanity's benefit. In other words, it can address both sides. It can say, yes, we're going to have this wonderful future of benevolence and whatever, but it will only come about through self-interested people like the drunken Zephyr Cochrane who wants his naked women and the rest of it. There's a very famous line, they built 3 films with the original crew around this mantra, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. It's what Spock says the first time he dies. It gets better, comrades. But they flip it. You know, everybody says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, proves that Star Trek is about socialism, it proves it's about collectivity, but they flip it to the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many. In other words, you know, you can play it both sides. You can appeal to that collectivity, you can appeal to that individualism. And I think that might explain that list of all the people I gave who are clearly not on our side of the barricades, and why they might be comfortable with Star Trek. It's an adventure show, it shows all these great individuals doing you know what they want, they go around, they give it hell and whatever. That you know, the ability to equivocate and you know, be politically vague enough, I think you know, allows that kind of big tent kind of thing. And I think at the end of the day, Star Trek is a Jetsons future. You know, we do humanity. You know, is there human nature? We talk about the way the bourgeoisie project a Flintstones future back on our history. So we've always been like this, and social relationships have been like this. Hanna-Barbera also did a future version called the Jetsons, and that is Star Trek. It's got better technology. Actually, in some cases now, it's not so great, isn't it? There was, you know, somebody asked about technology, and we have got the laptops and the mobile phones and people, you know, that actually echo some of the original series' technology. But there was a very, I think it's quite an interesting story when Roddenberry brought in a load of doctors to have a look at Dr. McCoy's medical bay, and he's saying, "What do you think of this?" You know, we had the top futurologists looking at this, and one of them looked at it and said, "This is '64." He says, "That's a pity you didn't have a look at one of our new beds. They're really good." So they were always lagging a bit behind the major technology. But you know, when people say that, you know, Star Trek is this socialist future, I don't think it is. It actually says at the end of the day that we're all killers at the end of the day. There's many episodes that talk about the beast within. There's that famous episode, The Enemy Within, where Kirk is split into 2 by the transporter. One good but weak, and the one bad is a brandy-swilling rapist, essentially. And he can only function when he's brought back together as one complete human being. In other words, we need this secret devil within, I think is what he's saying. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, there is nationalism in Star Trek. You know, there is the fighting that goes on, the territorial wars between the Klingons and the Romulans. There is racism. It's anti-alien racism, not human racism, but that seems to persist. There is clearly sexism with the cocktail dresses and the rest of it. There is money and commodity exchange. You know, Cisco's dad is a chef on 21st century Earth. He runs a restaurant in New Orleans. Well, does he just give food away? You know, in Uhura and Chekhov go shopping on in The Trouble with the Tribbles, and she buys tribbles with her credits. You know, there is shopping. Odo runs a bar on Deep Space Nine. He doesn't give the drinks away. you know, and property ownership exists in the future. Picard's brother farms ancestral vineyards in France. There's been a couple of episodes where they go back to open bottles and the rest of it. There's that wonderful episode of Mock Time when Spock is pulled like a salmon back to Vulcan to reproduce with his bonded wife, and she sort of she pits them against Kirk in this sort of ritual, and at the end he asks her to explain why she did it, and she says, "I don't really like you, Spock, and if you know, you'll be off soon, and I will own your property, I will own your land." So it's persists throughout the whole galaxy. I want to finish with a quote from Brett Spinner, and then I want to show this clip, if you'll indulge me, that's put into the mouth of Cisco. And I'll just frame the Cisco clip because it's set during a war, and a war that Starfleet is losing, and they might just win if their ancient enemies, the Romulans, come on their side to fight a common foe. The Romulans don't feel the need to; they're seeing their ancient enemies wiped out. So Cisco undergoes a plot to actually bring them in that actually it violates every ethic that Kirk used to run his life by, and I think it's very, very interesting because it backs up what Brett Spinner said in 2011 when he was asked about Star Trek. And he said, "I think there is an illusion about it. You know, if you ask somebody why has Star Trek lasted so long, they'll always say the same things, because it has a positive vision of the future. But to tell you the truth, I don't know what was so positive about it. We are still blowing people away. We carry guns. It's a bit of a joke. It's like the illusion that it is somehow all about peace, but it's not. It's a Western. It's a shoot 'em up. But it does have some nice ideas that you know, the people celebrate for who they are, the differences rather than and similarities are celebrated, and I think that's a very positive thing. The positive thing about it is it depicts an actual future, and that somehow is reassuring that there is going to be a future. I don't think necessarily it depicts a future that's better or worse than where we live right now. And I think that's true. I think Star Trek's a lot of fun, but it's not socialism, comrades. You know, we still got to fight for real socialism and a world where you're not a restaurateur or a starship captain or whatever, but that world that Marx talked about. You know, that you can be a herdsman in the morning and a poet in the evening without being any of those things. A truly liberating society. So I've got to tell you, comrades, vote out of the United Federation of Planets, and live long and prosper. And if you'll indulge me with this clip, thank you very much.
100 hours, station time. The Romulan Empire formally declared war against the Dominion. They've already struck 15 bases along the Cardassian border. So, this is a huge victory for the good guys. This may even be the turning point of the entire war. There is even a welcome to the fight party tonight in the wardroom. So, I lied. I cheated. I bribed men to cover the crimes of other men. I am an accessory to murder. But the most damning thing of all, I think I can live with it. And if I had to do it all over again, I would. Garrick was right about one thing. A guilty conscience is a small price to pay for the safety of the Alpha Quadrant. So I will learn to live with it. Because I can live with it. I can live with it. Computer, erase that entire personal log.
Live long and prosper.